Welcome to the recorded version of Finding the Balance, Enhancing Self-Efficacy in Persons Living with Dementia from June 26, 2018, part of the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series sponsored by the Administration for Community Living.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to add my welcome to Steve today. Thanks for joining us for the webinar. This webinar series, the Administration for Community Living's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center has partnered with the American Society on Aging, and we're pleased to have all of you in attendance today. Before I introduce our speaker, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide a brief welcome. Erin?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today to learn about the very important issue of self-determination and enhancing self-efficacy. On behalf of the Administration on Community Living, I want to thank Dr. Wehry for joining us and for sharing her wisdom with us and for everyone being here. So with that, back to you, Sari, so we can get to the content.
Thanks so much. So for today's webinar, we will hear from Dr. Susan Wehry. Dr. Wehry is a geriatric psychiatrist with more than 30 years of experience. She serves as the Chief of Geriatrics at the University of New England College of Osteopathic Medicine. I'll turn it over now to Susan for her presentation, and as Steve mentioned, we'll save the last 15 minutes for questions and answers. So Dr. Wehry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sari, and thank you everyone for being with us here this afternoon. I am really quite honored and pleased to be able to share with you some, I think, important information about how to enhance quality of life and quality of being for people living with dementia by paying particular attention to how we support their self-determination and how we enhance their self-efficacy. At the end of this webinar, my hope is that you will have an appreciation for the concepts related to autonomy, independence, and self-efficacy. These are three related but distinct concepts and definitions that I hope that you will have some mastery of. I also hope at the end of this webinar that you will be able to describe some approaches to dealing with diminished decision-making capacity in persons living with dementia by learning some new ways, perhaps, to support decision-making. I hope also that you will be able to go back and tell your colleagues who weren't able to join us about the positive benefits of self-efficacy and why we pay so much attention to this now that we know more about it because of the benefits on health and well-being. And then finally, my hope is that you will be able to describe ways and put into practice ways that you can enhance self-efficacy in persons living with dementia and their care partners. The outline for this afternoon or this morning, for those of you on the West Coast. The outline goes like this. I'm going to describe, first of all, the context, why this matters so much to me and where my interest comes from. Then we will look at the definitions and key concepts that we're addressing today. Then I'll talk about why I think this should matter to you, and for the professionals and care partners on the phone, why this matters a great deal to the persons you serve who are living with dementia. And then finally, we will talk about the policy and practice implications of our growing knowledge, if you will, in the area of self-determination and the importance of self-determination and self-efficacy. So let me start with a little story about how this came to matter so much to me. In the early 90s, I was living and working in Maine. I was in the early stage of my career, and I was asked by a woman and her attorney to represent her in a guardianship hearing that had been brought by her oldest son. Helen was a woman in her late 70s with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Her family, fearing the impact that she was having on her spouse and care partner at the time, wanted Mom very much to move into a nursing home. Family, however, was a little split because Helen herself was adamantly opposed to moving into a nursing home. Her husband felt like he could no longer care for her, And yet this was the early 90s, and supports for in-home care were somewhat limited, and only one adult child felt like she could give any assistance. Because Helen did not want to go into a nursing home, and because they were wanting to place her over her objections, the family petitioned for a guardianship. They sought the services of a psychologist who opined in one paragraph that indeed Helen had dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, and in his opinion would benefit from a guardian. Helen's attorney asked me to do a little bit more involved assessment of her decision-making capacity. And my findings essentially were that, as she herself observed, she was not able to adequately manage her finances. It was very difficult for her to balance her checkbook, for example. It was very difficult for her to make decisions about how to distribute her assets, for example, or to really understand the benefits and downsides of making different decisions. And so she agreed to have a financial conservator who would help protect her and her husband's assets, help her with her financial decision-making. On the other hand, I found that she really did have decisional capacity preserved in the areas of making decisions about how she would meet her basic ADL needs. She also had capacity retained for making medical decisions. So I went into court the way you can only do when you're much younger than I am now, armed with all of my data. I had against the other side's one paragraph, 8 pages of carefully assessed capacities, and gave my testimony to the court. At the conclusion of my testimony, in which my recommendation was that we accept her wish for a voluntary financial conservator and not place her under guardianship, the judge looked down at me, as only judges can, over his half glasses and said to me, "Dr. Wehry, do you agree that Mrs. Abbott has Alzheimer's disease?" "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "Dr. Wehry, do you agree that Alzheimer's disease is progressive?" "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "Dr. Wehry, do you agree that she is likely to not have capacity at some point in the future?" "At some point in the future, Your Honor, yes, I think it is likely that over time she may lose other capacities that she has today." "In that case, if we're all agreed this is progressive, Dr. Wehry, why are you wasting this court's time?" And with a slap of his gavel, Mrs. Abbott had a guardian, was placed over her objections in a nursing home, and died 6 months later. Now, that's the kind of experience that kind of can make you an advocate, okay? And it really kind of lit a fire in my belly for making sure that I was very attentive to educating the courts, very attentive to all efforts in guardianship reform, that I was very attentive when I was working with an individual living with dementia, that we took great pains to document all retained abilities and to work with families about alternative ways to deal with their fears as a person did have some diminishing capacity. This, of course, was also set against my ethical obligations to first do no harm. I took an oath back in the late 1970s when I graduated from medical school and completed my internship and residency. And I made a pledge to do no harm. And I came to appreciate that despite people's best interest, or having what they thought were the best interests of a person at heart, taking over decision-making for an adult and rendering them with the rights and responsibilities of a 6-year-old could be harmful, despite the best intentions. And I have an obligation to do no harm. I also have an obligation to do good. And when I was coming of age as a young physician, this notion of doing good was kind of tied up with Father knows best and Doctor knows best. And the notion of health professionals like myself taking an active role in doing good to enhance health and enhance well-being is something that many people resisted, I think. Many people who use services, many people who have diminished capacity, because for many years the notion of doing good was sort of tied up with this notion of Father knows best. And we've come a long, long way since then. I think at the head of most biomedical ethicists' lists is the notion that we also have an ethical obligation to respect autonomy. And I would add that this is critically important, even in the face of diminished capacity. Finally, sort of rounding out the biomedical ethics that are the bedrock of my decision-making, I have a priori obligation to advocate for social justice. So when I look at the issues that confront people who are living with dementia, and I realize the extent to which living with dementia threatens autonomy and threatens people's perception of individuals with a diagnosis self-efficacy, I feel like I have an obligation to at least educate about other ways to look at this whole area of self-efficacy and self-determination. So that's where I come from and what you need to know about the drivers for my pursuit of understanding self-efficacy and self-determination. So let's talk about these terms that I've been tossing about here and about which I'm sure everybody has definitely some understanding already. The term autonomy is really synonymous with the right to self-determination. At its core, being autonomous is about choice. It is about personal control. It is about one's destiny really being determined by oneself. Implicit in that, but I think often forgotten, is that within the right to choose, to self-determinations, to make decisions for oneself, there is implicitly within that also the right to fail. What a woman named Patricia Deegan, who wrote a lot and has written a lot about mental health recovery, has called the right to the dignity of taking risks. I think this is a critically important concept for us to work with, those of us who work with people living with dementia, because in the face of dementia, due to Alzheimer's disease or any other related disorder, the desire to protect seems to come to the fore, and trying to find a kind of common sense balance with letting a person experience some failure, letting a person living with dementia take some risks is, I think, very hard for care partners and for care professionals. But I really want to emphasize that autonomy is not just what time would you like your breakfast. Autonomy is really about what is important to you. What are your choices around your health care, around where you live, and so forth. This right to self-determination, this autonomy, is, as I think many of you probably know, embedded from a legal standpoint in the right to privacy. The legal doctrine, really, the right to privacy enshrined in the Constitution, is about the right to be left alone. And everybody has this right. And what's also important, I think, for you to know is that when the Supreme Court was asked in some case to test the extent of this, Chief Justice Warren Burger said, "It is clear that the Constitution intended to protect even foolish, unreasonable, and absurd ideas which do not conform." In other words, the right to be left alone, the right to privacy, the right to self-determination is not contingent upon making good decisions. It's a right to make decisions. But of course we know that for people with diminished capacity, even the ability to make the decision, to make sure that the person has sufficient information, is where the challenge comes up. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we sometimes fall back on whether a decision is good or not, as opposed to whether it's informed or not, when we want to take over decision-making for somebody with some diminished decision-making capacity. And we're going to talk some more about that momentarily. But this is the key concept here. Autonomy is the right to self-determination embedded in the law in the right to be left alone. And equally important to the legal protections for autonomy is the fact that autonomy is important for our health. This is central to quality of life. And there have been many studies that have demonstrated that this ability to exercise choice and control are important in terms of health, well-being, engagement in life, pain management, that it has implications for many domains, if you will, of well-being. And that's why we emphasize it so much, as well as the fact that it is a right. It is not the same as independence. Independence, of course, is most commonly defined as the ability to do things on my own. And what's been interesting to me over my whole career is what I would consider our over-attachment to the notion that we are independent. Because in fact, human beings by our very nature are social beings, and by our very culture are interdependent. We, in fact, the ability to give and receive help over our lifespan is one of the key maturational goals that we have. It's the key nature of human relationships and intimate human relationships, to be able to give and to be able to receive. And yet our attachment to this notion of doing it on our own, I can do it by myself, is behind a lot of practice and behind a lot of policy. I'm in the process right now of studying the many faces of dependency, the flip side of this coin, and have been very interested in the ways in which historically our healthcare system has actually created what we might call a structural dependency, in the way that we have set up long-term care systems, in the way that we have taken over for people in terms of doing things for instead of doing things with. And I came across a very interesting study that was actually a study done of older adults ourselves, in which someone interviewed a large number of community-dwelling elders and just asked them what this word independence meant to them. And the results may surprise you. Some older adults actually define accepting help at hand as a definition of independence, because it allows them to stay in their own home. And I was very struck by this because I have the same experience with my own mother, 94, good health. I say good health, I'll tell you why that's funny in a moment. Living independently in a condominium in Florida. And my mother recently underwent a surgical procedure for her congestive heart failure, had a repair to her mitral valve. She's had an excellent recovery. Now, my mother completely depends on her neighbors upstairs to check in on her, to drive her to church and to the grocery, to my sister to help her clean her house. And yet my mother describes herself, and with real clarity, that she is grateful for all of that help because it helps her remain independent. And one of the crucial findings, I think, among people who are looking at independence and dependence, that sort of continuum, is that when an individual is able to exercise choice and control over the help that is at hand, both the amount, who gives it, that is how much, how often, and the nature of it, that in fact it matches more closely the self-identity of being independent, and it makes it much easier for people then to accept services that are of their choosing, of their making, their design, and their control. So interestingly, independence no longer means simply doing things alone although that it still has that meaning. It also means accepting help so as to remain optimally independent, which for many people means staying in their own home. It means actually having family, friends, and resources in order to be able to access the services needed in order to be independent. And yet, still for others in this study that was done, being independent meant preserving their physical and mental capacities as long as possible and making accommodations as they declined. And so I think it's really important for us to not dismiss older people and or people living with or without dementia, dismiss their notions of preserving independence by accepting help. Now let's move to the next term here, self-efficacy, and see how it is different than, though related to the first two that we've been talking about. Self-efficacy is a very interesting concept related to one's belief in one's ability to succeed in reaching whatever outcome it is that one desires. So it is the belief, it is the confidence, it is the I expect my voice to matter in the world much more than the ability itself. That's the essence of self-efficacy. It is reflected in statements like, I can do this, or in the more cultural phrasing now, I got this. It is that conviction, in some ways, regardless of whether you succeed or not, that what you are doing is anticipated to be successful, that your voice makes a difference, that you are in charge of your destiny. And you can see there where it bumps up against the notion of autonomy. But the real difference here is that it is not about the right to privacy, the right to be left alone, the right to make your own choices. It is the conviction that in making your own choices, you can have a positive or favorable impact on what happens. And what I want you to understand about this is that this capacity for self-efficacy and the benefits of nurturing self-efficacy extend into the latest stages of a disease like Alzheimer's disease, which people progress through it in various ways. But for example, the study that is often quoted about this is where in a nursing home setting is where this was done. If you give people, even with advanced dementia, and by that I mean people who no longer have the use of words, recognize family or friends, whose relationship to the environment is really around knowing the difference between a soft touch or a harsh touch, a kind word or a harsh word, the difference between pleasure and pain, and sort of right down to the basics. If you give a person like that a choice, you hold up a red sweater and a blue sweater, and you say, which one do you want to wear? You hold up the red, do you want to wear this one? You take it back. Do you hold up the blue? Do you want this one? And if the person nods towards the red, and if you put the red sweater on, the person experiences a boost in their self-efficacy as evidenced by they're having a better day, meaning less agitation, more calmness, more smiling, if smiling is something that they are still able to do, more cooperation, if you will, with care. It's a really fascinating study. On the other hand, if you hold up the blue sweater and the red sweater, they nod towards the red and you give them the blue, saying something like, oh, why don't you put the blue sweater on today? Your daughter's coming to visit, and she really likes to see you in this blue sweater. The person experiences a diminishment of their self-efficacy and will not have as good a day. So the emphasis here is on knowing that you are seen and knowing that you are heard. And it manifests itself, obviously, differently depending on where you are in the process of a disease like Alzheimer's disease. Now, of course, this matters to all of us because there are a lot of people worldwide living with Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. And people living with dementia, I'm sorry to say, too often live in fear. They too often live with anxiety when they are challenged in their efforts to impact their own world. And as the result of that fear, and that result of fear of losing their autonomy or reprisals from their family if they get something wrong, who will then want to move in with more supports than they feel like they need, they feel like they lose options in where they're going to live. In that situation, people living with dementia are likely to minimize their deficits and mightily defend their independence, even in the face of the evidence, if you will, or even in the face of the facts that they're actually having a hard time caring for themselves. People will defend it. This isn't delusional. It isn't bad judgment. It's a psychological reaction. It's a defense mechanism. It's an effort to ward off other people's helping hands, if you will, when they come in prematurely. These fears of reprisal, of losing their options, fear of loss of autonomy, are often accompanied by the fear of becoming a burden, the fear of loss of control, and in many, many people, this is older adults with and without dementia, these fears, frankly, are greater than the fear of death and greater than the fear of the illness itself. For many people, staying in their own home becomes synonymous with remaining independent. And one thing I think is incumbent on policymakers and upon practitioners is to begin to challenge that notion. I'm not suggesting that we not honor people's wish to stay at home. What I'm suggesting, though, is that there is no reason that we can't honor autonomy in institutional settings. But as it has been for a long time, people fear that if they move into a higher level, they will lose their autonomy, they will lose their self-efficacy, and they will sum this up as losing their independence. There is no question but that the diminished ability to make decisions threatens autonomy and self-efficacy, but it absolutely need not. Let me tell you a quick story about Pearl. Pearl's a woman I met during family mediation. Pearl was a woman who had dementia due to vascular disease and also the complications of chronic alcohol abuse. When I met Pearl, she was living semi-independently with a man many years her junior, whom her children described, not affectionately, as a gigolo. There was pretty good evidence that, in fact, Pearl was being financially exploited. And so her children, who numbered 3, decided to seek guardianship for Pearl to protect her assets. And there was no evidence, really, that the children were trying to protect their inheritance. In fact, they hoped that Mom would live a long life, and their stated intention was to make sure that her assets lasted as long as she did. So the family was a little split on how best to accomplish this, but no one was, there was no disagreement about the wish to have this man no longer live with her and no longer have access to her resources. From Pearl's point of view, she had been taking up with men like the man in her home all of her life, and she had every intention of continuing to do so. He brought her happiness, and if he was misusing her money, so be it. This was sort of her attitude. Now, here was the big difference. 20 years prior to this, Pearl was living a similar kind of life, much to the anguish and agony of her children. But at that point, she did not have vascular dementia. At that point, she could bounce back, as she did many times, as she relapsed and recovered from her alcoholism. But at this point, in her late 70s or mid-70s, she had less resilience, less reserve, both financially and physically, and in fact, the cost of being exploited, if you will, or the burden, was growing. So we had family mediation, and we eventually arrived at a agreement, all parties, including Pearl, that her funds, her resources, would be put into a trust for her long-term care needs, should she have them, and that she would be given basically a very generous allowance that she could spend however she pleased. It will surprise probably no one on the call that within a month of that agreement, Pearl had gone through all of her money within the first week. And so she began making the rounds of her children. And she would call John and say, "Don't tell the others, but I just need a little advance. Could I have a little against next month?" And then she would call the next child and say, "Don't tell the others, but I need a little advance on next month." And before you know it, Pearl was accessing a lot more of her resources than I think the mediator originally imagined. But she felt more in control. It allowed her, I think, to actually give up driving more easily than she might have otherwise. And she was able to live pretty much as she wished until a rather large stroke landed her in the hospital, and then eventually she died. So it was a common sense kind of balancing approach that acknowledged the needs of the children, acknowledged the needs of Pearl, protected her somewhat, tried to do some good, tried to find some middle ground, but also allowed her autonomy, and I think was actually probably a pretty good outcome. Now take a look at this man, and let me tell you that he has dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. And let me ask you, what do you see? Do you see a man with dementia, as I've told you he has? Do you see a person with dementia? Or, even knowing his diagnosis, do you simply see a person? To me, this slide kind of captures what is at the heart of and what provides the kind of the basis for, if you will, taking this approach towards maintaining personhood, which includes supporting people with diminished capacity. In other words, if you want to adopt these practices, it starts with making sure that you see the person. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you see the person, you see who that person is. As important is that you see that who a person is as important as what he or she has. You see that who a person is from her point of view is more important than what she has. When we look at a person, we're looking at what the person can still do as well as what they can't. This is really what person-centeredness means to me. To the person, if you ask people living with dementia, particularly those who can articulate something about their experience in the early stages, they will ask simply that we see them. Please see me. I am not changed by my diagnosis. Let me tell my story in my own time, in my own way, for my own reasons. And I will tell my story to family and friends in my time, in my way, and in my reasons. I'm imagining that there's actually not been a lot for you to object to in this call so far, and yet we might ask ourselves, then why is it that people living with dementia so often find that their adult children or their spouses want to take decision-making from them? And I would say really that the motivators can be grouped this way. It is out of fear, frustration, and frankly, filial and spousal love. If we want to change our thinking about that, to sort of get away from fear-based decision-making, I propose that you start thinking in terms of what a person can do, as you see on your screen, rather than what they can't do. A lot of professionals, when families say, "What stage is this?" will pull out the Barry Reisberg or some modification of it, and they will go through this deficit-based approach to looking at or to understanding the future of Alzheimer's disease. Fair enough, but an alternative way is to say what a person can do, because there is much that is preserved. And if we wish to preserve, not just preserve but enhance self-efficacy, and if we want to remind ourselves of the importance of supporting decision-making, then I think that we are aided in that if we start staging from a strength-based perspective. So support for persons living with dementia is going to be about finding this balance, enhancing self-efficacy and supporting decision-making. So what's that look like in practical terms? So in practical terms, I think supported decision-making actually has some pretty clearly defined tools that might help with this. One thing is to, first of all, make it a practice, a habit, to always include people living with dementia in decisions that impact them. That's both a right and good health practice. It's equally important then to make sure that any materials that are used in making decisions be in simple, plain English and not in lawyerese and not in hospitalese. This is not about protecting other people's liabilities. This is about common sense language for the common sense need of what do I need to know to be able to make this decision, put it in plain language, and then see what's most helpful to a person. If it's not words, can you put things in pictograms? If not pictograms, can you use sort of audio form of providing information? Whatever is best for the person. Decision-making also must, the person living with dementia, to be supported in making decisions, must be given extra time to discuss their choices. And not just time in a single setting or seating, but perhaps coming back to revisit decisions more than once. Which means that decisions should be made, sort of thinking about decisions in a regular way and not in crisis mode. Creating lists of pros and cons is often very helpful to people. Role-playing activities to help people understand their choices can be helpful to some. One of the great things in the supported decision-making movement from the world of people living with disabilities is the notion of bringing a team to bear on supported decision-making, rather than the way we often do it, which is, in the event you can't make decisions for yourself, who would you like to have do that? Turning that around and saying, it sometimes is hard to make decisions, and we all have people that we consult when we have decisions to make. If you have decisions that you have to make that you're finding hard to make, who would you like on your team? It might be someone from a faith-based community, it might be a friend, it might be a family member, but to recognize that this disease progresses for different people over different times, over different periods of time, and what abilities are retained are going to vary from individual to individual. So for some decisions, your best friend might be the best person to help. For others, it might be an adult child in whom you have confidence. In others, it might be your spouse, and so on. But to start thinking in terms of teams and not just individuals. And then in terms of paying bills, helping people set up automatic bill payments and bill management systems that will take away some of that decision-making over time and giving the person the ability to make the kind of initial decision up front. And then what you see on your screen there is a tool from the American Bar Association that I think is just super, because it frames the question in a strength-based way, saying, consider whether the individual can meet some of these needs. And I understand there's been a previous webinar on this, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I did want to make sure that I called it to your attention. Supporting decision-making and enhancing self-efficacy requires that we start conversations now about advanced care planning, about what palliation is, about what hospice care is, how they're different, and to have those conversations while a person living with dementia is able to have them. I think increasingly people are becoming familiar with the so-called 5 questions that Atul Gawande has made so popular. And these 5 questions really are a matter of, or a way of understanding what is a person living with dementia's understanding of their own illness. Individualizing support based on values and strengths is more important than individualizing support based on needs if you want to enhance self-efficacy. Identifying a person's specific goals, not the healthcare professional goals, enhances self-efficacy and then can be used to support decision-making. In fact, almost anything you do can be an occasion to either enhance or diminish the person's sense of having their own voice. I think I've emphasized this enough that self-efficacy is so important because it enhances well-being, so I will just skip over this and then talk about the literature that says how we do it. Enhancing self-efficacy is really a matter of creating or allowing for opportunities to arise in which the person can experience some mastery. In other words, actually having something to do that they can accomplish. Maybe it's making a meal, planning for a meal, whatever, for a person living with dementia. But mastery experiences and the chance to overcome a little bit of hardship is critically important. Interestingly, observing other people overcoming hardship, as might happen in rehab facilities, for example, where people observe other people overcoming hardships, is a way of enhancing self-efficacy. Verbal persuasion, as it says here, or simply pep talk is the way I might prefer to put it, or acknowledging to the person that you have confidence in them, that you believe in their ability to impact the outcome of their lives is an important aspect of enhancing self-efficacy. And then, as I've been emphasizing, really creating control points for people. If you do home visits, the time that you come, how you spend your time, what options people have, and presenting all of that realistically without bias. Some of the most interesting data is coming from the field of physical exercise, in which physical exercise, particularly in a group where the facilitator of the physical exercise works hard to keep, to get people involved, and also makes clear that they have expectations for everyone to have some success, and that they are interested in helping people meet their individually derived expectations. People who have experienced, people living with dementia who have experienced this kind of physical exercise program also identify having someone push their limits a little bit as a key component of what is successful for them. Now, I have just a minute left, so I'm going to tell you just a really quick story, and then in the next two slides just mention briefly what I think are some policy implications. My father-in-law died with Alzheimer's disease about 4 years ago, and about 10 years prior to his death, I would visit him on the other side of the country, actually, quite infrequently, something on the order of once a year. And one time I visited him, and I was interested in setting up FaceTime video conferencing with one of his children living back on the East Coast. And so we set up Skype. I think may have been FaceTime. Didn't really matter. So I was setting it up. I was showing him how it worked and showing him how he could do it. And he had, frankly, no capacity to actually learn and remember. He, as it turned out, didn't even have the capacity to follow the instructions that I wrote out for him so very carefully, so that he might be able to learn it and do it in my absence. His wife was pretty critical of the amount of time that I was spending trying to help Joe learn how to do this. But when we Skyped back home, he was so happy, and he kept turning around saying, "Hey, look, there's Mike. Hey, look, there's Mike," as if he were seeing it for the first time, and it gave him enormous pleasure. When I left on that particular occasion, as I was leaving, he looked at me and he said, "I don't know who you are, but I always learn something when you come," as if I were coming often, and he beamed. Now, he had no idea what he had just learned, and partly it was a socially gracious thing to say, and partly it was being nice. But I actually think that it was that interaction also that enhanced his self-efficacy, that in my interactions, which he then decided to experience as frequent, what he experienced was my confidence that he could learn something. And it, I think, alters his brain chemistry and helps him have a good day. So it's that lived experience as well as the literature that makes me want to keep doing this. So I think some of the policy implications are simply that we start being more sophisticated in our notions of autonomy and independence, self-efficacy, and we get away from this oversimplified dichotomy between being independent or dependent, between having capacity or not having capacity, and that we begin to recognize and appreciate that self-determination is multidimensional. I think that we also have to start asking different questions. I think the questions we need to ask are, what are the personal and social factors and processes that actually help shape supportive relationships, not support independence in this narrowly defined way? And to start asking people actually who are living with dementia how they perceive their strengths and their problems, how those problems can be converted to challenges that they can master, and what do they think of the supportive relationships. So in closing, let me say, I hope you take away these thoughts. I hope you appreciate that being able to do is as important as can't, or can do is as important as can't, that you are attentive to false dichotomies in your own work, in your own language, that you have a better appreciation for the fact that self-efficacy can and should be enhanced, and that support for decision-making is possible, preferred, and will actually promote acceptance of support. So thank you for being here. I'm just 2 minutes over my time, and we have now 13 minutes for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wehry. This is a great presentation. We do have a number of questions that have come in while you were speaking. And I want to remind folks that they can enter their questions in the question and answer session of the webinar platform, and we will get to as many of them as we can. I want to start with a question about, you mentioned 5 questions and throughout your presentation about, I would say about 6 slides ago, and we have a number of people who are asking, what are those 5 questions?
Yes. So the 5 questions are some that, again, Dr. Gawande talks about, though I don't think he came up with them. They're kind of the standard in palliative care. And so you ask a person with a chronic serious illness to simply tell you what their understanding is of their current health or condition. That's number 1. And then you kind of see what they understand and what additional information they may need or want about their current condition. And the second question is, if your current condition gets worse, what goals would you have for your life, and what goals would you have for your health care? So if things got worse, what would be important to you? What would your goals be? The third question is, what are your fears? What are your fears about what happens with you? What are your fears about your family? What are your fears about the impact on people important to you if your condition worsens, or frankly, even if it stays just as it is now? So what are your fears is question number 3. Question number 4 is, are there any trade-offs you're willing to make or not make? Those of you who have been through or know anyone who has been through cancer treatment can begin to appreciate how this question might take form. What are the trade-offs? You know, I'm willing to put up with a lot of nausea and pain of treatment if, in fact, the likelihood that I will live to see my daughter get married, if I will live to see my son graduate, if I will live to do whatever, is the kind of thing we're talking about here. What trade-offs are you willing to make? Are you willing to experience more pain in order to have a conscious dying process? If you're talking about end-of-life care. So are there any trade-offs you're willing to make, or are there any that you're not willing to make? That actually you'd rather be less conscious and have less pain, or more conscious and more pain, if that's the sort of trade-off that's being made. And then finally, question number 5 is, what would a good day look like? And for those of you who have read Being Mortal, know that Dr. Gawande's father answered this by saying, a good day would be having a bowl of chocolate ice cream. A good day would be being able to sit up in my bed and hold my grandchild. That's what is meant by a good day. Those are the 5 questions.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question here. Just scrolling back up to it. So someone wrote in about concerns of the baby boomer generation and lack of savings for retirement and long-term care. And in our system of care, choice, they were saying, comes from the amount of money you have. So if there's more and more people entering Medicaid waivers, the choice is then dictated by the plans of care available and what services are available. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the best way to move forward with having to balance state budgets and then creating waivers that allow for this choice that you talked about?
You know, I think that it's a complicated and multifactorial question, obviously, but I'll give it a shot. I think that there have been many efforts to look at different ways to actually finance long-term care. People have looked at long-term care health insurance, which has really not provided the kind of security that most people would like. But that is, again, something that is there. Now, in the initial phases of long-term care insurance, no one in the insurance industry expected people to live as long as they did. And so it turned out, from their point of view, not to be the most viable business model. And so I think that long-term care insurance, while perhaps one part of the solution, may need to be repackaged. With respect to the impact on state budgets, there is no question but that, and this has been demonstrated in my home state of Vermont quite a lot, and I think other states as well now, that home and community-based services are quite simply less expensive. And engaging people in their communities of support as opposed to just relying on families might be one way to maximize home and community-based services. But frankly, this is fraught as well, because the concerns about social isolation continue to grow in the home and community-based world. And my response to that is that it is our obligation, I think, to let older adults themselves identify if this is one of those trade-offs they're willing to make. I mean, I believe in the value of social connectedness, but that is a decision actually that each individual living in their own home needs to make. So I think states can actually save money. That's just been so well demonstrated by giving people more choice, not less choice. This is true even within managed systems. And I think also this movement called age-friendly community building that the World Health Organization spearheaded a decade ago is going to be another way that older adults, particularly the boomers who have been mentioned, begin to maybe come up with some innovative situations. We've seen in Beacon Hill in Boston the originators of the Village to Village movement. We've seen in Detroit recently a fascinating move towards creating tiny home villages and cooperative living. Co-housing is certainly another way. So I guess my feeling is that this has created an enormous opportunity among a generation of problem solvers to be creative, and absent adequate public financing in some arenas, to make optimal use of that public financing. Those are some thoughts about it. I mean, clearly no answers, but I think that there is absolutely opportunity here if we're willing to be creative and not, limit ourselves to the models that we currently have. The final thing that I'll say is that while facility-based living is the most expensive and the most dreaded by a lot of people in their later years, I think that the culture change movement has had a little bit of impact, has some positive impact, major impact in some areas, to make the group congregate living situation perhaps less undesirable. And if we can continue efforts towards the small householder model, that we might be able to find some ways of doing that as well.
Great, thank you. We received a question about for some advice or your take on the situation. What can you do when healthcare professionals are not promoting self-efficacy in a facility or an assisted living? How might you approach them?
So I approach it in a couple of different ways, and I've had many opportunities actually to do that. So I think one is to get the leadership, say, of an assisted living company or an assisted living facility or the health professionals there on board with the concept. Frankly, self-efficacy is not something that has been taught. I know in medical schools, I don't know about nursing schools, but it's a relatively new concept applied to this population. So start from the assumption that people actually don't know a lot about it. And so if you start from the standpoint of this is how you do it as opposed to this is why it's important, it might be a little harder to overcome some of the resistance to it. I think that that's one. I think secondly, acknowledging that this kind of change doesn't happen right away, but you need to identify whom the leadership is most responsive to. In a lot of places, particularly assisted living companies, it's the adult child who's paying the bills, who is like really the power there. And so you have family nights. You say, wow, I just learned about this cool thing called self-efficacy. This is what it's done. This is how it's done. This is what it means. This is why it is so important. And so you get families to be advocates for enhancing self-efficacy as well. It really takes getting a couple of advocates or champions for the notion. And I think that when people hear enough stories, when people see enough of the positive benefit of self-efficacy, all you need is one to start the conversation and then to look at ways within current programming to just make some alterations that create more opportunities. I'll tell you the biggest problem that I encounter in the situations that the questioner had is overcoming our litigation fears. Our risk aversion is really potent culturally, and so I've become quite sensitive to that. That's a tough one, and it really needs to be done community by community. So that's really the best I can do on that. But if you have a specific project in mind, whoever that questioner is, send me an email. My address is still up there, I think, and maybe we can figure out a little project.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, when you think about the dignity of risk and empowering individuals to make their own decisions, do you have any recommendations for risk-benefit analysis tools?
Boy, that is a great question, and I don't. But I'm going to make a note of that. I'll tell you the work that's been done in the risk-benefit analysis area is really probably that practical tool that I mentioned earlier, because that was something developed actually for attorneys, but with some input from psychologists. And so that practical tool, the PRACTICAL, stands for something, and I forget what. I only showed you one page from it, the reasons, but it's probably the best starting point, but I don't have a good tool from a purely clinical standpoint. But that's where I'm actually going to take a look as well and see if that might put me onto something also. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you so much. So that's come to the end of our time together. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and special thanks to Dr. Wehry for taking time out of her schedule to put together this presentation and provide such wonderful information for our group.